Okay, we are past the midpoint, so way to go, but your reward for getting past the midpoint was you had a really hard week in the text. This was the part of the text where we finally get to what's going on with Melchizedek, and it is hard. And so I hope that between what you did in the homework and what we're going to talk about in the teaching time, that these passages begin to take shape for you in a way that you can remember them for years to come. But we finished up in our last teaching session with the warning being concluded that had gone on for quite some time. We were sufficiently warned against laziness and that we should move on toward maturity, spiritual maturity. And then we were finished off with a nice little touch of encouragement. He reminded us that we have a sure and steadfast anchor for our souls. And we looked at that picture of the boat that is moored into the harbor even while the storm is going on. And that is the pattern that we've seen again and again in Hebrews, where he gives us a description of what is better. And then he warns us against taking that lightly. And then he gives us encouragement. And we'll continue to see that. We've been through 3 warnings, which means that we have 2 more to go, and you can be looking out for them. But this session, we finally get to talk about Melchizedek and his better priesthood and the better covenant that is associated with it. And I'll just tell you, this is one of the reasons that I love doing Bible study this way, because bumping into these passages on a random stroll through the Bible, if you were just flipping around trying to have a quiet time, you would find these intimidating and off-putting, and these are the kinds of passages that make us think, this is just too hard for me. But we have an opportunity to look at them within the span of the entire book of Hebrews, which helps us. It gives us clues as to what's going on in these particular portions, because by the time you get to them on this round, you already have been marking and seeing some of these themes emerging. We've been looking for that elusive eastern bluebird, as I talked about at the beginning of the study. We've been looking for those details so that we can develop a sense of what's going on. So we're going to jump right in. We have 2 chapters to cover. It is a lot to get through, but you can do it. I'm also hoping that I can do it too. We will find out. So here we go. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 7 of Hebrews, it says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever." No problem. You guys are whiners. This is the easiest thing ever. Okay, so we had you in your homework go back and look at Genesis chapter 14 for this original story about Melchizedek interacting with Abraham. And it was a story where Abraham has defeated these kings in battle, and now he has all of the spoils of the battle, and he's greeted by Melchizedek, who comes out to meet him bearing bread and wine, and he gives him a 10th of everything that he has received from the battle. And so the details that we pulled from that portion of the text in your homework were that Melchizedek, like Christ, is a king of righteousness, that he is a king of peace, and that he brings bread and wine, these very important symbolic images that he brings with him. He is a priest of the Most High God, that's the way he was described in the text, and that he is someone who blesses Abraham, which we'll expand on in just a minute, and then he receives tithes from Abraham. So now it only remains for us to figure out why these details are important and how they point us toward a similarity with Christ. So we get this brief history lesson here, and you notice how quickly he refers to this portion of the story, and this is his habit in the text anytime he's referring to the Old Testament, is he gives you just sort of a snapshot of it. And why is that? Because we're going to see him do that with the tabernacle and the priestly service. Remember, it's because he assumes that these stories are deeply familiar to you already. So that can be both a challenge to us and an encouragement to us in the way that we view them. But look at verse 3 in particular. It says, "He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. He continues a priest forever." Okay, so I asked in the homework, is this a literal or a figurative description of him? Like, did he really have no time when he was born and no time when he died? Well, of course, we know that what's going on here is he's drawing a literary parallel from the person Melchizedek, who was an actual person who we can assume was born and died, but his birth and death are not mentioned in the account in Genesis. So he's taking advantage of that ambiguity to make a correlation between who Melchizedek was and who Jesus is, that Jesus has no beginning of days nor end of days. And so he draws that similarity there. Without father or mother or genealogy, does that mean that he was parentless and descended from no one? No. He's pointing out there that he is not of the tribe of who? Levi. That he's not from the line of Aaron. And that's a significant thing about Melchizedek in the Old Testament. If you think about it, Abraham is the original Hebrew. There were no Hebrews before him. And so when Melchizedek, his contemporary, comes out to greet him, we would assume then that he is not a Hebrew, because there is no such thing as the Hebrew nation at this point. And yet he is called a priest of the Most High God. So he's going to use that to establish a precedent for there being a priest of the Most High God who is not from the line of Levi, but who fulfills all of the priestly duties in a way that is going to be better. Okay, and think about how he's already comparing, as a priest who continues forever, how this compares to the Levitical line. At age 25, the Levites were able to start their service in the temple, but they didn't do full service. They were serving their brothers for a period of 5 years. And then at age 30, they took on the full duties of their role. But guess what happened at age 50? They retired. They served for only 20 years, and then they were done. So their service is temporary. Not only is it temporary, it doesn't even fill up the full expanse of a lifetime. So there's a comparison being made here between one whose entire lifespan, which is without beginning or end, is to serve in this capacity, and then this Levitical priesthood. And also think how many priests there would have been across the years. Every year needing to raise up the next generation, always bringing up the next ones in the line. Let's move on to verse 4. It says, "See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers. Though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, in other words, the Levites. But in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives." This is so clear, I don't know why you had trouble with it. "By one of whom it is said that he lives." Who is that? That would be a reference to Melchizedek/Jesus. So the comparison is being made here, and the point is being made that an inferior is the one who receives a blessing from a superior, which means we would infer that Abraham is the inferior to Melchizedek, who is the superior. And now he's going to get crazy. Look at verse 9. He says, "One might even say," because this is the kind of thing I sit around thinking all the time, "one might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him." Great. First of all, I always love getting to talk about loins at Women's Bible Study. But here's something that we're missing. Here's a little history piece that we're missing when we get to this part of the text. In the ancient Near Eastern mindset, they believed, they didn't know all of the modern reproduction information that we have. And they believed that a man's descendants were inside of him. Like that all of his descendants were in him waiting to be placed in a woman and then given birth to. This always cracks me up because I always remember Claire is my third child, and she was asking me about babies and where do they come from and all of that, which is always a super easy conversation. And she said, so when Matt was born, I was in your right leg and Mary Kate was in your left leg, right? And it's just so funny to me. It made me think about this. It seems weird to us because we have ultrasounds and we have all of this information about where babies actually come from. But in a time when these things didn't exist, this isn't as ridiculous as an assumption as it might sound to our modern ears. But what on earth is the point? Well, he's basically saying that because Levi hadn't been born yet and Levi is descended from Abraham, that in effect, Levi is giving tithes through Abraham to Melchizedek. So the entire Levitical line would be inferior to Melchizedek. That's the point he's making, clear as mud. Let's keep going. We're only on verse 11. Verse 11 says, "Now if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron?" So what's he saying? This line is not able to perfect people. Now, we've dealt with this issue of perfection. You're marking it each week as a theme that you're carrying through. And you know what we're not saying? We're not saying that we can actually be perfect. He's talking about being made holy, okay? And so he says, what further need would there have been for another priest if the Levitical line could have accomplished this for them? And then in verse 12 he says, "For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe from which no one has ever served at the altar." So who's he speaking of? The one whom these things are spoken. That's Jesus, right? And what's he doing? He's answering a silent objection that his listeners would have raised. They would have said, okay, we see where you're going with this. But there's no way that you can say that Jesus is like Melchizedek in a priesthood because he's from the tribe of Judah. And so he's going to deal with that head on. He's saying there would need to be a change in the law. Well, what change in the law is there going to be from the Mosaic covenant to the new covenant? Okay, so he says in verse 14, "For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests." So he acknowledges up front, I get it, this is where your heartburn is. But he's going to keep with his line of thought. Verse 15, "This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life." So what does he point them back to? He says, sure, I can see where you would say he couldn't be a superior high priest had there been no precedent. But there is a precedent, and it's Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a shadow, and Jesus is the fulfillment. So verse 17, he says, "For it is witnessed of him," meaning Jesus, "you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." So here he is. He's back in Psalm 110. He quotes Psalm 110 over and over again in this letter. "For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness." Okay? And then in verse 19, he says, "For the law made nothing perfect." So the law was weak and useless when it came to bringing people to an internal righteousness. He says, but on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. Now, I think that we have probably read this multiple times and in various contexts. This is one of those verses that sometimes you hear, this idea of drawing near to God, but I don't think it hits us the way that it should. Like, let me read that again with a little different emphasis. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. Who drew near to God under the old covenant? Only the high priest, and only once a year. And yet what is he saying? This is so much better because now we draw near to God. So the law is defined as weak and useless. Why? Because it can't perfect anyone. All it can do is point out their sin. So we have a priest who has strong and eternal credentials, and then we have a priesthood that has weak and temporary credentials. And what is he saying? This is a better priesthood. So we have a priest who is descended from on high versus a priest who is descended from Levi. Which is better? A priest who is descended from on high. And now he's going to go on to talk about we have an oath versus no oath. Which do we want? We want an oath. Verse 20 says, "And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said, 'The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever.'" This is pointing back to what we looked at in our last teaching, where we talked about the significance of the oath combined with the covenant. The covenant is God speaking his perfect truth, and the oath is him assuring it with his perfect authority. And so we see that idea applied here now to this idea of the priesthood. And then in verse 22, he goes on. He says, this makes Jesus the guarantor of a what kind of covenant? Better covenant. Here comes the language, and you're getting to mark it now, and it's pretty fun. And sometimes it's a little hidden, but that's part of the fun of Bible study, is getting your colored pencils and going on a treasure hunt. I'm not weird, you're weird. In your homework, I asked you to look up a definition for that term guarantor. And what I found was one who promises to pay a debt if the debtor defaults. One who promises to pay a debt if the debtor defaults. How many of the debtors have defaulted on the law? All of us. All of us. Isn't it significant that we find this language embedded in the Lord's Prayer? Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who have laid debts against us. He is our guarantor of a better covenant. He is the one who pays the debt that we have defaulted on, that we could not pay ourselves. Verse 23, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, and I hope you marked that with a giant T as a therefore, consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. So saves to the uttermost. We've been marking perfect in the text. Did you mark uttermost with the notation for perfect? He is able to save completely or perfectly. And we would add on top of that he is able to save them eternally. He is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near, there's that language again, to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And that word intercession literally means to stand between for them. So he stands between God and man. And what does he do? He brings the sin and the guilt of man before God. He brings the grace of God to man. He brings the words of God, the truth of God to man. He brings the prayers and the words of man to God. He is the one who stands between for us. And the contrast that we're given here in verses 23 through 25 is that there is one priest, and that is better than many priests. We have one priest who is superior to all of these priests who have come before, who were limited by their lifespan and their time of service. So then we move on to verse 26, and he says, for it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, and then he's going to describe him, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sin and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Okay. So look at this description that he gives, because it's another silent comparison point to the earthly priesthood. He is a high priest who is holy, but the earthly priesthood was not holy. He is a high priest who is innocent, but the earthly priesthood was guilty. He is a high priest who is unstained, but the earthly priesthood was certainly stained with sin. He is a holy high priest who is separated from sinners, but the earthly high priests were sinners themselves. He is a high priest who is exalted above the heavens. They are earthbound and time-bound. Not only that, but instead of many sacrifices, he offers one. And we're going to see that idea keep being developed over the next several chapters, so I won't belabor it here. So then, in summary, what do we see? We see the imperfect priesthood of the Levites surpassed by the better, perfect priesthood of Christ. Man, I tell you what, chapter 7, not the easiest chapter in the Bible, but we did it. Now we got to get through chapter 8. Are you ready? Starting in verse 1. He's not done. He says, now the point in what we are saying is this. I like that he's like, I think maybe they're a little fatigued at this point, so I'm going to reiterate. I like that he's with us on that. He says, now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and minister in the holy places in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent, I hope you marked that as a better in your text, as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For that, if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. So let's pause there and just make sure that we got what we needed to from these opening lines, and then we'll hit our big quote from Jeremiah. So he points out that we have a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of majesty. We've already heard this idea. It occurs 4 times in Hebrews. We talk about him sitting down or being seated, and what is the significance of that? What about the Levitical priesthood? There was no sitting for them. There was no piece of furniture included in the tabernacle that was a chair for them. The only chair in the whole tabernacle isn't even a chair at first sight. It's the mercy seat. And so what do? They serve daily, in and out. They do all of their duties, but you know what they don't do? They don't sit on the job. There is no rest for the Levitical priesthood. But we find rest in Christ, who is seated at the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven. And what's now he's saying? There's a true tent. You've only seen this temporary tent, but there is a true tent that it was pointing you to. These are shadows. These are just copies. They're telling you about something that is better, that is true, that is real, that is unseen. And I'm asking you to put your faith in this thing that is unseen. He's developing that theme. He wants them to know that the things that they have held dear and the things that they are tempted to return to were just the very first whispers of a truth that is much bigger and much better than anything they had in Judaism. And look at verse 8, he says, "For he finds fault with them when he says, 'Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah.'" So who does he find fault with? Israel and Judah, right? And what is it? He's saying there needs to be a new covenant. Verse 9, "Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord." Now, before I get into the part that we all love and we're all familiar with, bear in mind that this is the prophet Jeremiah saying these things. The old covenant is still alive and well at this point. They're still trying to figure out what the fulfillment of the promises are. They're not even going to recognize it when it hits them square in the face. And yet here Jeremiah is saying, you know what you need? You need a new covenant because the old one isn't working for you. And it doesn't say he found fault with the old covenant, does it? What does it say? He found fault with them. Why? Because the old covenant was dependent upon their obedience, which is why the new covenant is so much better. Because in it we have a guarantor for the debt that we could not pay. So what does he say? Let's look at what he says about the new covenant. Verse 10, but just imagine who's hearing this. It's people who are like, wait, there's another covenant? Verse 10, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts." Why is that better? Where was the covenant written prior to this? Tablets of stone. What is external, I will make internal. And I will be their God, and they will be my people. So the covenant will have a better location, and the covenant will enable a better relationship. And then look at verse 11. And they shall not teach each other, each one his neighbor, and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Do you hear it? Better access. Look at verse 12. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. Better covering. Better covering. He's going to come back and he's going to quote this again later on in the letter. So we're not going to belabor this quote right now, but just know it's coming back for you and we're going to spend more time on it. Look at verse 13. He says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one, what's that word? Obsolete. And in the homework, I asked you to look that word up in the dictionary. And the definition I found was no longer used because it's been replaced. No longer used because it's been replaced. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. I asked you in the homework to paraphrase verse 13. I don't know what you wrote, but I paraphrased it in 3 words. Let it go. Let it go. And this is actually a very compassionate message that he is giving to them, although he himself probably couldn't have known how compassionate. Because what was obsolete and about to go away in 70 AD? The temple itself. You heard he's just described in this section that the sacrifices are still going on. They could go to the temple and see the sacrifices, the temple which would have been familiar to them from their upbringing. They could still go and see the sacrifices being made day after day. And what is he saying? It's obsolete. It's ready to vanish away. Now, what if I told you that as a reward for coming to the Bible study, I was going to give one lucky attendee a new phone? Would you like that? What if I told you that it was this phone? Beep boop, beep boop. You remember this guy? Circa 2004, about 15 years old, doesn't have a camera. I remember being excited when I got one of these because it had T9, and so if I needed to send a text, I could, hit the button 3 times and get it to the right letter that I wanted. Some people were more proficient at that than others. But how excited would you be to get this phone today? Be like, I can't even use that phone. What if I were giving you this phone? Better, right? Better. The iPhone came out, very first iPhone came out in 2007. And you know what happened to this? Nobody wanted it anymore. Except for people who don't like change. Do you know anybody who still has one of these flip phones? Mm-hmm. 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 We have to be very careful. For us, it may not be that we are living under the old covenant, although it very well may be that we love legalism and we don't want to let it go. Because legalism felt comfortable and it felt predictable and it felt like something I could control. I'm good and God rewards me. I'm bad and God punishes me. And we just tell ourselves that sweet little lie that more times than not, I'm good, not bad. That's how legalism works. Or at least I say I'm not as bad as the person sitting next to me, so I'm probably doing okay. I think that comes up fairly often, actually, with us. But it feels comfortable to us because it's what most of us knew before we came to faith. We may not have been good at legalism. We may not have been the good girl who was good at following the rules, but we certainly knew the rules were there and we should have followed them. Felt sufficient guilt that we hadn't done the right thing. And the problem that we have is that we have left behind, even though we are under a new covenant as the children of God, that just feels natural to us. And that's the problem with sin. It feels more normal to us than holiness, which is why so often in the church today we devolve into a light form of Christian karma instead of grace. You know how I know that we're prone to Christian karma? Because on the day that adversity visits us, how often are the first words out of our mouth, Lord, why is this happening to me? Didn't I do all the things you asked her? I mean, more than average, right? Like on average, I was doing better than the other Christians that I know. So why is this happening to me? And do you hear that? Do you hear in that? You're clinging to what is obsolete. You don't want this. You can't even take a selfie with this, guys. You don't want this. The old has gone, and the new has come, and the new is infinitely better. Now, unlike this phone, which I'm just noticing has 500 notifications on it as I'm holding it up, unlike that phone, my new phone, which, a year from now will be the old phone, the new covenant, which is grounded in the eternal finished work of Christ, will never be obsolete. Thanks be to God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that Jesus Christ has enacted a better covenant for us, that it is sealed by an oath and that he is the guarantor, that he steps in and pays our debts when we faithfully default at every turn. Lord, sometimes it seems that the only faithfulness we can produce is unfaithfulness. But by the power of your Spirit and your indwelling word, you change us increasingly day by day to look more like Jesus Christ. We praise the name of the one who is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And we say these things in his name. Amen.